In the quiet neighborhood of Maplewood, excitement filled the air as siblings Elijah and Tasha set up their lemonade stand in front of their house. The sun beat down on the sidewalk, making it the perfect day for their refreshing drink. Elijah, the older brother, carefully arranged the plastic cups while Tasha stirred the lemonade pitcher, making sure it was just right. Their motivation was clear. They wanted to earn money for a new video game. This goal fueled their enthusiasm as they put the finishing touches on their makeshift stand, complete with a hand-drawn sign advertising their wares. As the first customers approached, both children beamed with pride. Neighbors, drawn by the children's cheerful voices and the promise of cold lemonade, began to gather. Mr. Johnson from next door was the first to buy a cup, praising the perfect balance of sweet and tart. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street brought her grandchildren, turning the simple transaction into a social event. Elijah handled the money carefully, making sure to give correct change, while Tasha poured generously, occasionally adding an extra ice cube on particularly hot orders. Their teamwork was seamless, each complementing the other's strengths. The positive response from the community encouraged the siblings. They laughed and chatted with their customers, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. Some neighbors lingered, sipping their lemonade and catching up with one another. The lemonade stand was quickly becoming more than just a business venture. It was turning into a neighborhood gathering spot. As the afternoon wore on, Elijah and Tasha's confidence grew. They had already sold several pitchers worth of lemonade, and their money jar was filling up nicely. The dream of owning that new video game seemed closer than ever. However, the cheerful scene was about to change. From her large house down the street, Karen watched the proceedings with growing displeasure. Her frown deepened as she observed the diverse group of neighbors congregating around the lemonade stand. Without warning, she emerged from her front door, her face set in a mask of indignation. The atmosphere shifted as she approached, her presence casting a shadow over the once joyful gathering. Karen's anger escalated quickly as she watched the lemonade stand from her porch. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice sharp and insistent as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's a disturbance in the neighborhood," she claimed, her eyes fixed on Elijah and Tasha's stand. "These children are operating an illegal business and causing a public nuisance. I want them removed immediately." The siblings, initially oblivious to Karen's actions, continued serving lemonade to their customers. However, they soon noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Some neighbors began to whisper among themselves, casting worried glances towards Karen's house. Elijah and Tasha exchanged confused looks, unsure of what was happening. As word of Karen's call spread, the neighborhood quickly divided. Some residents, friends of Karen, or those who shared her views, began to voice their support for her actions. They muttered about property values and proper conduct, casting disapproving looks at the lemonade stand. Others, however, rallied around the children, outraged by Karen's extreme reaction to such an innocent activity. The once peaceful street was now a scene of growing tension. Supporters of both sides began to gather, their voices rising as they argued about the situation. Elijah and Tasha, caught in the middle of this unexpected conflict, looked around in bewilderment. Their simple dream of earning money for a video game had somehow sparked a neighborhood dispute. As the situation escalated, the children's grandfather emerged from the house. A tall, dignified man with gray hair and kind eyes. He had lived through the civil rights movement and recognized the undercurrents of racial tension in the unfolding scene. He approached slowly, his presence commanding respect from many of the neighbors. The grandfather surveyed the scene with concern, noting the angry faces and raised voices. He could see the fear and confusion in his grandchildren's eyes, and his heart ached for them. He knew that what was happening went far beyond a simple dispute about a lemonade stand. It was a manifestation of deeper, more insidious problems that had long simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful community. The grandfather, recognizing the gravity of the situation, decided to take action. He approached a nearby neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching the scene unfold with a look of concern. "You know," he began, his voice low and measured, "this reminds me of a time back in '63 when I tried to open a small business in my old neighborhood." Mrs. Thompson turned to him, her eyebrows raised in interest. The grandfather continued, "They didn't want a black-owned business on that street. I faced threats, vandalism, and even police harassment. It wasn't about the business. It was about who I was." His words, spoken without bitterness but with a deep sadness, made Mrs. Thompson shift uncomfortably. As the grandfather shared more of his experiences, Mrs. Thompson's expression changed from interest to shock, then to shame. She had never considered how such everyday acts could be tainted by racial prejudice. The grandfather's stories opened her eyes to a reality she had previously ignored. Just then, a car pulled up to the curb. Mark, Elijah, and Tasha's father stepped out, his face etched with concern. He had received a frantic call from a neighbor about the commotion and had rushed home from work. Mark, a respected district attorney, quickly assessed the situation. He approached the group, his presence commanding attention. "I'm Mark Johnson, Elijah, and Tasha's father," he announced, his voice calm but authoritative. "Can someone tell me what's going on here?" The neighbors fell silent, many looking away awkwardly. It was Elijah who spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "Dad, we were just selling lemonade, but then that lady called the police on us." He pointed towards Karen, who was still standing on her porch, arms crossed defiantly. Mark's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He turned to Karen, who was now looking less certain of herself. "Ma'am," he called out, "I'd like to hear your side of this story. What exactly is the problem with my children selling lemonade?" Karen, realizing she was now face-to-face with a professional lawyer, stumbled over her words. They're disturbing the peace. It's not allowed, is it?" Mark seized this opportunity to address the larger issue at hand. "Let's talk about what's really going on here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't about lemonade or noise. This is about confronting our biases and the way they affect our community." Mark, sensing the tension in the air, decided to take a more constructive approach. "I propose we all sit down and discuss what happened here today," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This isn't just about a lemonade stand. It's about how we treat each other in our community." His suggestion was met with mixed reactions. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, seeing the value in open dialogue. Others, including Karen, shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to engage in such a discussion. "We can use the community center," offered Mr. Rodriguez, an elderly man who had been watching the scene unfold. "It's neutral ground, and there's plenty of space for everyone." As word spread about the proposed meeting, more residents began to show interest. Mrs. Patel, who ran the local grocery store, offered to provide refreshments. "If we're going to talk, we might as well do it over some food," she said with a warm smile. However, not everyone was on board with the idea. Karen, still standing on her porch, called out, "This is unnecessary. We don't need to make a big deal out of this." Her words were echoed by a few others who seemed uncomfortable with the prospect of confronting racial issues in their community. Mark, undeterred, addressed the skeptics directly. "I understand some of you might be hesitant," he said, "but ignoring these issues won't make them go away. We have an opportunity here to make our community stronger." As the adults debated, Sarah, Tasha's best friend, watched from her front yard across the street. She had been too scared to approach earlier when the commotion started, but now she felt a mix of emotions. She was angry at how her friend had been treated, but she also felt a twinge of guilt. Had she ever acted in a way that made Tasha feel unwelcome or different? Sarah's internal struggle reflected a larger awakening happening among some of the younger residents. They were beginning to question the attitudes they had grown up with, recognizing the harm caused by unchecked biases. As the crowd slowly dispersed, with many agreeing to attend the community meeting, Mark turned his attention to Elijah and Tasha. The siblings looked shaken but relieved that their father was there. "You two okay?" he asked gently, pulling them into a hug. They nodded, still processing the events of the day. The next day, as Elijah and Tasha hesitantly set up their lemonade stand again, Sarah made a decision. She crossed the street, determination in her steps, and approached her friends. "Hey guys," she said, her voice a mix of nervousness and resolve. "Can I help out today?" Tasha's face lit up at her friend's offer, while Elijah nodded appreciatively. Sarah's presence sent a clear message to the neighborhood. She stood with her friends against injustice. As the three children worked together, pouring lemonade and chatting with customers, the stand began to attract more attention than ever before. Neighbors who had stayed out of yesterday's conflict now approached, curious about the interracial group of friends working in harmony. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly African-American resident, stopped by for a glass. As she sipped her lemonade, she began to share stories of her own experiences with discrimination in Maplewood decades ago. Her words captivated not only the children, but also the small crowd that had gathered around the stand. Inspired by Mrs. Johnson's openness, other neighbors began to share their own stories. Mr. Patel recounted the challenges his family faced when they first moved to the neighborhood from India. A young couple described the subtle prejudices they encountered as an interracial pair. The lemonade stand had transformed into an impromptu forum for discussing race and empathy. People who had lived side by side for years were suddenly seeing each other in a new light, recognizing shared struggles and the pain caused by prejudice. Even some of Karen's supporters from the previous day stopped by, their curiosity overcoming their initial reservations. They listened to the stories, some with skepticism, others with growing understanding. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere around the lemonade stand grew more relaxed and open. Laughter mixed with serious discussions, and new connections were forged over cups of lemonade. Elijah, Tasha, and Sarah worked tirelessly, serving drinks and facilitating conversations. They may not have fully understood the significance of what was happening, but they could feel the positive change in the air. By the end of the day, the lemonade stand had become more than just a way to earn money for a video game. It had become a symbol of unity and a catalyst for change in Maplewood. The children had unknowingly created a space where difficult conversations could happen and where the community could begin to heal its divisions. A week after the lemonade stand incident, Mark's proposal for a community dialogue came to fruition. The local community center buzzed with activity as residents filed in, a mix of anticipation and apprehension on their faces. Mark stood at the front of the room, welcoming everyone. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today, we're here to listen, learn, and hopefully grow as a community." He outlined the format. Anyone who wished to speak could do so, sharing their experiences with race and discrimination in Maplewood. As people settled in, an unexpected voice broke the silence. Mr. Thompson, a longtime resident in his 70s, stood up. "I've lived here for 50 years, he started, his voice wavering slightly. "And I've seen this neighborhood change a lot." He went on to describe how his family had been one of the first black families in Maplewood, facing hostility and exclusion. Mr. Thompson's story touched on the sensitive issue of gentrification. He spoke of how rising property values had forced many of his old neighbors to move away, changing the fabric of the community. His words resonated with many in the room, prompting nods of understanding and murmurs of agreement. As Mr. Thompson concluded, a palpable shift occurred in the room. People who had entered as mere acquaintances now looked at each other with newfound empathy. The shared experience of hearing these personal stories created a bond among the attendees. However, the mood soon shifted as Mrs. Anderson, known for her vocal opposition to affordable housing initiatives, stood up to speak. Her comments about maintaining neighborhood standards sparked tension, with several people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This was followed by Mr. Ramirez, who recounted his struggles as a Latino business owner in Maplewood. His story of perseverance in the face of discrimination inspired many, but also highlighted ongoing issues in the community. As more people shared their experiences, old rivalries between families began to surface. The Johnsons and the Petersons, whose feud over property lines was well known in the neighborhood, exchanged pointed glances as they each recounted their versions of past injustices. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, with conflicting narratives and long-held grudges threatening to derail the productive dialogue. Mark watched carefully, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing the community to navigate these difficult conversations on their own. As the community dialogue continued, Karen found herself increasingly uncomfortable. She had arrived at the meeting determined to defend her actions, but as she listened to story after story of discrimination and prejudice, her resolve began to waver. The turning point came when Mr. Lee, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, stood up to share his experience. "I've lived in Maplewood for 30 years," he began, "and I've always tried to keep to myself. But last year, someone spray-painted racial slurs on my garage door. No one in the neighborhood said anything. No one offered to help clean it up." As Elijah and Tasha served drinks to a long line of customers, their grandfather stood nearby, a proud smile on his face. He saw in his grandchildren's actions echoes of the civil rights movement he had been part of decades ago. The fight for equality was far from over, but in Maplewood, at least, a new chapter had begun. The sense of unity in Maplewood was short-lived. 3 weeks after the community dialogue, Karen began to have second thoughts about her public apology. Feeling that she had been pressured into admitting fault, she started working behind the scenes to undermine the progress made. Using her connections in the neighborhood association, Karen began spreading rumors about the legality of Elijah and Tasha's lemonade stand. She claimed that the children's success was drawing undesirable elements to Maplewood, thinly veiling her racist intentions behind concerns for property values and community safety. Mark, alerted to Karen's actions by a sympathetic neighbor, was furious. He had hoped the community dialogue would lead to lasting change, but it seemed old habits died hard. Determined to protect his children and the progress the community had made, he decided to take action. Gathering evidence of Karen's activities, including emails and recorded conversations provided by concerned neighbors, Mark called for an emergency meeting of the neighborhood association. The community center was packed once again, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Mark took the floor, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We're here because the spirit of unity we found a few weeks ago is under threat," he began. He then methodically presented the evidence of Karen's attempts to discredit Elijah and Tasha's lemonade stand and stir up racial tensions. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as Mark's presentation concluded. Karen, caught off guard by the public exposure of her actions, attempted to defend herself, but her words rang hollow in the face of the damning evidence. In a dramatic turn of events, several board members of the neighborhood association called for Karen's immediate removal from her position. A vote was held, and the result was unanimous. Karen was out. As Karen left the meeting in disgrace, the community rallied around Elijah and Tasha. Plans were made to officially recognize the children's lemonade stand as a symbol of Maplewood's commitment to inclusivity and racial harmony. The meeting concluded with a renewed sense of purpose. The residents of Maplewood had faced a test of their newfound unity and emerged stronger. As people filed out of the community center, there was a feeling that real, lasting change was possible. Elijah and Tasha, watching from the back of the room with their parents, realized that their simple desire to sell lemonade had sparked a transformation in their community. It wasn't always easy, and there would likely be more challenges ahead, but they had shown that even small actions could lead to big changes.